Hey, so Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to the Canadian Muslim Mental Health Conference. I'm Dr. Kogali. I'm a family physician, and today I will be moderating this session on mental health within Black communities. We'll be looking at strength, unity, and action. We are very pleased and honored to be joined by our keynote speaker, Dr. Kameelah Rashad. Highly anticipated speaker. Before we begin, a few announcements. There will be interactive polls in some sessions, so look out for these and participate. You can earn points for engaging in various aspects of the virtual conference, for your chance to win a complimentary registration for our next conference, or one of two $25 gift cards to Amazon. You can earn points for things like answering poll questions during sessions, posting about the conference on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're using the hashtag CMMHC 2020, and also earn points for completing the course evaluation forms. Speakers are happy to answer questions during the Q&A period. Please post them in the Q&A section, not the chat, and I will be sure to keep track. Also, please note that sessions on December the 12th are not accredited. Sessions on December the 13th, so tomorrow, are accredited. And feedback for the session and the conference can be provided digitally after the conference with a Google Form survey. Further resources are available at www.muslimmentalhealth.ca. So goals of the session. First, would like to understand the intersections of Black identity with age, gender, heterogeneous cultures, and Islam. Two, we're going to be looking at reviewing systemic discrimination and impact on mental health. We'll be addressing exclusion, racism, and dehumanization towards Black Muslims. And thirdly, we'll be looking at commitment to becoming anti-racist, so taking initiative and being action-oriented. I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Kameelah Rashad. Dr. Rashad is the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation, which promotes healing and emotional well-being in the American Muslim community through dialogue, education, and training. Through it, she established the annual Black Muslim Psychology Conference and the deeply rooted Emerging Leaders Fellowship for Black Muslim young adults. She's the founding co-director of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. This is an initiative launched in collaboration with Muslim Anti-Racism Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative to address needs for effective planning, preparedness, and organizing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Rashad, who previously served as the University of Pennsylvania's Muslim chaplain, now serves as a fellow for spirituality, wellness, and social justice, and she advises the Black Muslim Student Organization. Dr. Rashad's clinical and research areas of interest include diversity, religious identity, and multicultural issues in counseling, healing justice and faith-based activism, racial trauma and healing, psychological impact of anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Blackness, and Black Muslim intersectional invisibility. Dr. Rashad earned her Bachelor of Arts and Master's in Education from the University of Pennsylvania, her major research paper in restorative practices and youth counseling from the International Institute for Restorative Practices, and she also earned her doctorate degree in clinical psychology at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Rashad, a very warm welcome to you. It is a real honor having you with us today, and I thank you for giving us your time. I know our audience is in for a real treat.
Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you for having me. You caught me in the midst of actually tweeting about the conference. So if folks are still wanting to join, the hashtag is CMMC 2020. Is that right?
CMMHC 2020.
Okay.
Jazakallah for tweeting. Thank you so much, Dr. Rashad.
Okay, I'm trying to multitask. I can do this. So again, I thank you so much for hosting the conference. I know it was really, really difficult to bring people together virtually. I think some of us may have a certain degree of Zoom fatigue. It's become part of our lives. But inshallah, the information that I'm able to share with you today will be beneficial. And I hope that it is the beginning of many conversations about racism, race, mental health, and also the particular way that the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting us, and in some ways exacerbating um, existing vulnerabilities of many communities. And it's also highlighting perhaps areas of growth as a community that we can engage in. So I'm actually going to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint to share with you all. Um, and I'm going to be watching to make sure I stay on my time, because I do want to leave some room for folks if you have questions. This is fairly comprehensive. And again, I see it as the beginning of conversations that we can have, not just sort of one event, but ongoing reflection for us as a community. Okay. And sometimes when this happens, okay, there we go. So our sort of focus today for this keynote is understanding mental health within Black communities, within Black Muslim communities. And, you know, one of the things that I think is really important for us to bear in mind is that we all have sort of identities that impact how we view the world, how we understand ourselves and our places in the world, and also our well-being. And so when we're thinking about the particular context of Black Muslims in the US and in Canada, I tried to make sure that my information was inclusive of North America and not being very US centric. But there are many similarities between the Black American context, the Black Canadian context, and also those Black or African Muslims who are in the UK. And so when we think about the Black or African diaspora around the world, when we're living in non-Muslim majority countries, racism, Islamophobia, just white supremacy are hugely impactful always, and in particular in these contexts. And so it goes without saying that there's also going to be an impact psychologically and emotionally and mentally as we sort of grapple with um, all of the ways that we are trying to understand how to not only survive these contexts, the pandemic, but also how to thrive, how to raise children that are healthy and well and confident in who they are. And so I want to begin with um, just restating again our objectives for this morning, understanding the intersections of Black identity, the impact of systemic discrimination, and then also what are some of the key takeaways for us to begin to think about our own positions within the broader Muslim communities, both in the US and Canada, and what does it mean to be someone who is introspective and not simply reactive or performative in our commitment to anti-racism. So I want to give some general background because one of the sort of concepts that I'll talk about is understanding intersectionality and intersectional invisibility. And so while Black Muslims in the US are about 1 in 4 American Muslims identify as Black or African American, right? And what we also know from historical records is that a third of enslaved Africans were Muslim, right? So that's a significant number of individuals who were practicing Islam, who were practicing Muslims. There were many scholars who were also enslaved. And so when we think about the ability to sustain practice through enslavement, right, was very, very difficult, but there are threads that remained even till today. So US born descendants of enslaved Africans in the US and in the Caribbean are comprised of Black Muslims in the US, and those who are immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. 63% of US born Muslims are converts to Islam. Again, a very significant majority. And so even when we think about the African American community or the non-Muslim African Canadian community, there are connections to Islam that may not be readily apparent. Within the US context, again, Muslims, the American Muslim community is one of the most ethnically diverse faith communities in the country, okay, with no clear majority, but between 20 to 25% of those who identify as Muslim are African American or Black. Now, if we think about sort of the statistics from the Canadian side, what I'll say, or these numbers aren't always accurate, right? There are numbers ranging from 3 to 5 million Muslims or more in the US. And in the context of Canada, this is a 2019 study done at the University of Toronto, that there are approximately 1 million Canadian Muslims. I think that that's more, that the number may be a little bit conservative, but this is based on survey data. Some people may not respond, but from that information, what was gleaned based on self-report is that about 6 to 8% of Canadian Muslims identify as of Black or African descent. And you'll find, just like in the US, concentrations of Muslims in Canada, in Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. And so those cities, those major Canadian cities, also being Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. So Dr. Fatima Jackson Best is a Black Canadian Muslim, very well respected researcher. And she talks about, again, the connections between Black Canadians and Black American Muslims, and that there are histories of enslavement and colonization that sort of predate the sort of the census, right? And so when we think about when did Muslims first arrive in the US, well, there were Muslims here even prior to Christopher Columbus. And there were Muslims also that migrated, right, of those enslaved people in the US, also migrated to Canada. And there was also enslavement and the slave trade that happened in the entirety of North America. And so there are many histories that we have to explore. And so these numbers sort of give us a starting point, right? It gives us a vantage point in which to think about what are our assumptions about who American Muslims are, who Canadian Muslims are, and do they represent accurately what we know to be true about the diversity of our communities? Often they do not. Islamophobia has played a really impactful role in shaping narrative and media depictions of who Muslims are. And so what's important to think about is intersectional invisibility. And what that means is there's, even within minoritized groups, right? And I say minoritized because depending on your context, right, we are not minorities, right? We're the global majority identifying as people of color. And so within a specific context, minoritized. And so it is the failure to recognize that people have multiple identities, right? We are Muslim. I identify as one who was born Muslim, of convert parents, of descendant of enslaved Africans in both the US and in the Caribbean. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. I'm one of 7 children, right? So all of those are roles or identities that I have that tell you a story about who I am. But what happens within those minoritized communities is that when there's a concerted effort to depict, right, who we are in a certain way, often people don't think of American Muslims or Canadian Muslims as Black. And depending on where you go, right? So I was born in New York, spent most of my life in my adult life in Philadelphia. There are large Black Muslim populations. But when you go elsewhere, right? When you go to, say, Kansas or North Dakota, even some places in the South, like Mississippi, you don't see many Muslims of Black or African descent. And so what people come to know of Black Muslims is very little. And so it's the tendency for those who do not fit sort of the typical or the stereotypical representation or depiction of that minoritized group to become invisible, right? And so becoming marginalized, even within your marginalized group, right? And so this is, I'll show you visually here. Black Muslim intersectional invisibility looks like, on the one hand, on your left side of your screen, Black Muslims don't fall into either category, right? So Black, again, stereotypically comes to mean Christian, right? And there's an assumption of Christianity within the Black community. And there's also religious privilege, right? Both the US and Canada are Christian centric countries. That is something that will not be readily admitted, but it is in fact the case. And then on the right hand side, Muslims are typically depicted as of either Arab or South Asian descent, as either foreign, immigrant, brown, right? And Arab and Muslim being used interchangeably or synonymously, when in fact there are sizable Arab Christian communities as well. And so when you're standing at the intersection of both Black and Muslim, right? There can be aspects of your reality of your experiences that are very exclusionary, right? That you may be in a predominantly Black community, right, that is Christian, and people may question your racial identity, right? Or question, why are you of a different faith? Within the Muslim community, there is, much research of experiences, quantitative information that unfortunately tells the story that there is anti-Black racism that exists even within the faith community. And so when we think about what happens, right, in the midst or standing at that intersection, um, and feeling as if you're excluded or barred from a sense of belonging to either, right, what is the result, right? How are you perhaps vulnerable in very unique ways, right? And what does that mean in terms of health? So these are the questions that I really think we need to consider. So I want you to think for a second, right, about what comes to mind when you see an image like this, right? You may think, well, toxicity of pollutants in the air, um, of negative impact even on health, right? Breathing, lungs. So we understand toxins or pollutants, pollution in the environment, right, in ways that are usually depicted like this. So here's another example, right? So when we think about air pollution in major cities, we think about global warming, we understand the impact of pollution, like of man-made sort of circumstances that lead to an erosion of health, of physical health, but also of psychological health. So I want us to think about, if we explored what are the pollutants in the environment, right, of a psychological nature, right, in the context for Black Muslims that can also lead to toxicity, right? So I want us to think about this. Social toxicity refers to the extent to which the social environment in which individuals are raised is poisonous, right? Serious threats to the positive and healthy exploration and development of identity, health, and well being of individuals, families, and communities. And so it's often easy for us to think about or observe the pollutants or the toxicity in the environment, right? We can see it, right? We can smell it. We can feel its effect on our bodies. Um, but when we think about social toxicity, it becomes a little more difficult, right? Because these things may feel so ubiquitous, right? And invisible that we don't really understand the impact it has on us until we really take a closer look. So I'm going to show you some images that speak to the social and cultural poisons that are psychologically equivalent to lead and smoke in the air, right? These have a detrimental impact on the mental health of Black Muslims. So this image was taken from a protest of a young Black Muslim man who was found hanging from a tree about 3 years ago in Washington State, right? Originally, his death was ruled a suicide. The community felt otherwise, and especially given the history of lynching in the United States, thought there's more questions that we have to ask, and the FBI open an investigation, because this just didn't seem plausible. And so when we talk about even Black Lives Matter, right, and the tragic killing of Black individuals, Muslims are also included in those names of individuals who have been murdered. So this gentleman, Muhammad Muhaimin, was killed about 2 years ago. And what the reports eventually, right, years later, demonstrated was that the police officer actually mocked him as he killed him. He said, well, you know, the family reported that he was pleading and saying, you know, Allah help me. And the police officer said, well, Allah, he's not going to help you right now. Okay. So these are toxins. These are the poisons that are in the environments of those who are attempting, right, to live healthy lives. This was a headline taken from this past summer, right, following the murder of George Floyd, the pandemic within the pandemic, right, the pandemic of racial violence occurring simultaneously with the pandemic of the coronavirus. And so it's very, very unsettling to even think about the possibility of protesting when there are questions about infection, about exposure. Fortunately, what we know kind of months later is that those protests did not lead to an increase in spread of the coronavirus. So, you know, alhamdulillah for that, but just imagine sort of the deep commitment to protesting, to raising one's voice about the injustices that are being committed. And these were protests happening around the world. And also at the same time, trying to be very thoughtful and vigilant about one's physical health as well. Black people in Toronto, this is from the Ontario Human Rights Commission 2 years ago. Black people in Toronto are 20 times more likely to be shot dead by the police. From the earlier slide, the highest or one of the highest concentrations of Muslims in Canada is in Toronto, where you find a large Black Muslim community. And so when we think about, again, we tend to separate these issues, that there are Black issues related to police brutality and violence, and then there are these Muslim issues, right? But issues that affect Black people are Muslim issues because there are significant communities who identify as both Black and Muslim. This is a headline just taken from September in Edmonton. Black Canadians hit hard by COVID-19, right? Thinking about the impact on financial health, the kinds of employment or work that Black Muslims are engaged in, if they're essential workers or not getting proper protective equipment in order to safely come to work, or who are working hourly wages. And so a day off could mean a significant drop in income, right? And so I thought, again, if we're looking at where is the evidence, right? If we think about social toxicity and how difficult it is to kind of see with our eyes in the same way that we can see pollution, we can take a look at headlines, right? And think about what are the images and the words, the language that is also being used to describe this phenomenon or the pandemic within the pandemic. Anxiety over racism heightened for many Black Canadians in COVID-19 isolation. So again, thinking about I think Hiba did a really nice job of talking about, you know, what is the chronic stress that people experience while dealing with COVID? Well, there's also a chronic stress associated with racism and discrimination, right? And this can heighten, again, if there are economic vulnerabilities, social vulnerabilities, and concerns about perhaps whether or not, right, there's debate, at least I know for sure here in the United States, about vaccination, right? In the United States, and I'm sure similar to Canada, there are histories of medical abuse and sort of egregious abuse of power related to science and the medical industry. So people are rightfully wary, right, or concerned about, well, how do we know this is going to be safe, right? And so all of these anxieties are definitely related to one another. And again, at the intersection of being both Black and Muslim are very significant. Combating anti-Black racism in Canada will, quote, take more than a village, Black youth say. And this is an initiative that was launched by these two young women. And I think there's sort of the misconception that the United States, sort of your neighbor to the north or to the south, um, has more racism. But I think, you know, what many have written about far more eloquently than I have, is that it also exists. This is systemic discrimination that exists globally, right? And it is manifested in different ways. So racism in Canada is ever present, but we have a long history of denial, right? So it's sort of tempting to compare comparatively, right? If we look at sort of Trump and uh, 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 United States, that's glaringly sort of egregious. But we also have to think about sort of the context in which racism and discrimination emerges in Canada as well. This poll that was done about a year ago says nearly 50% of Canadians think racist thoughts are normal, right? So again, these are thoughts that people have, they're invisible, but we can start to begin to analyze the behavior and the impact, or what is the result of those thoughts on the well-being and the health of Black Muslims in both countries. So I sort of want to summarize what those images tell us, right? That Black Muslim social toxins, those factors that are impacting the health and well-being of Black and African Muslims, right? With COVID-19 and police brutality as being comorbid, chronic stressors at this point, those toxins fall into at least one of these 6 categories, right? If not more, but I felt like these sort of capture generally the experiences of many Black Muslims. So white supremacy and capitalism, again, kind of rooted a system of an economic system that's rooted in exploitation and in having a poor and underclass, often those who are impacted the most by poverty in both countries are Black, right, and are Black Muslims. There's incarceration, monitoring, surveillance, detention, anti-Muslim bigotry and violence, which is on the rise in both countries, anti-Black racism, and that's both in American or Canadian society and within the Muslim communities in each country, right? And so when we think about what are the experiences of Black Canadians broadly, right, there is one of having to grapple with what does it mean for me to be discriminated based on race by someone who also shares the same faith, right? This can be very, very exhausting, draining, hurtful, and painful when you think about especially the Islamic values and principles that are um, in very much support of justice, equality, and so acts of racism and discrimination are antithetical to Islamic values, but it happens, right? Because we're people, we're human, and so while Islam has clear guidance around how people should be treated, this is not always the reality that Black Muslims encounter. So there's racial trauma and violence, again, historical, intergenerational, and then Christian hegemony, again, being of both a racial and religious minority, and the fact that there is Christian privilege, right? At least in certain places, when you see Christmas trees, when you see lights, right, there's an assumption that these are just holidays, right? But if someone were to travel in any place and see signs for Eid, for example, it would kind of be shocking, surprising, or raise concerns, right, depending on the place that you're in. And so this idea of religion being normative, right, Christianity being normative, is very much apparent. So Dr. Kenneth Hardy is a psychologist at Drexel University here in Pennsylvania, and he says that racial oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence, which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. Okay, so the experiences of Black Muslims, the social toxins that are present in the environment that are poisonous, right? White supremacy, anti-Black racism, Christian privilege, and Christian hegemony, those can impact not only the mind, but the body and the spirit as well. So I want to just take a minute to pause because I shared a lot of information. And I think it's worth at times thinking about how we take all of this in. So I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinician, by training. And so I think it's important for us to consider how we feel when we start to notice or become aware of the systemic injustices that exist and how they impact Black Muslims in particular, right? So if you have a pen and paper or something to write with, I want you to just write down how you're feeling, right? What are some of your thoughts that you're having, right? What do you notice about your body, right? Where there's tension, where there's confusion, um, where there's maybe sadness, frustration, and write those things down, right? Because they're becoming aware of those social toxins, becoming aware of how pervasive they are, should make you feel something, right? So I want you to get in touch with what that something is. Okay. So just write that down, take it in. Okay. So now what I want you to do is take a look at this feelings wheel. And I want you to select just 2 words that might capture what you just wrote down or how you're feeling, what you're thinking about, right? The information is eliciting something, and I want us all to get in touch with what that something is, right? So if you take a quick look around this feelings wheel and identify 2 words that may describe what you're feeling right now. Okay. So I want to give some really quick definitions of trauma, and again, relating back to how this impacts Black Muslims. So Ta-Nehisi Coates is an American author. In his book Between the World and Me, he says, but all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience. This is why I wanted you to identify what you're feeling. It's a visceral experience, right? It dislodges brains, it blocks airways, it rips muscle, extracts organs, it cracks bones, it breaks teeth. You must remember that the sociology, the history, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. So I wanted very quickly just highlight these 3 aspects, right? So trauma generally, right? Experiences that are overwhelming, lead to feelings of being unsafe, right? Are maybe isolated, alone. And it could be something that you witness, right? Not just something that happens to you, but then there's also historical trauma, right? So this cumulative effect of wounding across generations. So thinking about the transatlantic slave trade um, in all of the Americas, and then racial trauma, right? So that particular symptoms and signs and experiences that people have when the stress that they face is related to their racial or ethnic identity. So Claudia Black is someone who has done a lot of work in terms of trauma and family life. And many clinicians kind of use this sort of analogy of like big T trauma, right? So what do we mean by that? It's usually something universally recognized as disturbing, overwhelming, very impactful. And it's usually like these major events, right? Natural disasters or war, witnessing violence, chronic neglect, right? Again, what is visible, right? Like those sort of pollutions in the air. We can see it, right? We can see that the air is not very good today. Our visibility is low. So that's kind of like the big T trauma, right? Something that we can readily recognize. Little T trauma, right, are things that may be a little more subtle, right? Invisible sort of to the naked eye, but they're very present and have a real impact on us emotionally, right? Physically, psychologically. And so it could be one of these examples on the right of your screen. Okay. So what is important to remember about the impact of historical trauma on Black people and Black Muslims specifically, right, is that these could be events that have happened generations prior that are still having a reverberating effect today, right? So, traumatic stress reactions, including grief and other strong emotions, increased risk of substance use and dependence, vulnerability to mental health disorders, and also the increased risk of experiencing other traumas given the context. So this is another way of thinking about what happens, right, from conception, right, and inheriting that historical or intergenerational trauma and the impact it might have on one's lifespan, right? That could mean premature death, early death, um, vulnerability to sort of pre-existing conditions that are preventable, but often don't get treated because of health disparities, right? This all has an impact. There's also another way of thinking about intergenerational trauma. And this quote here is from the American author Maya Angelou. And she says, "Mother told her secrets to me. When I rode low in the pocket between her hips, I learned the rhythm of her song." And what's important to remember about this is, when we think about Black maternal mortality rates, both in the US and Canada, they're very alarming, right? So the conditions of the Black mother as she's carrying a child and then thinking once she gives birth to that child, the environment that can be very toxic to the health and the well-being of that child is just glaring. And so the question that I often ask of people who are trying to think about, well, how do I understand intergenerational trauma in my own life? I think, what happened to your mother? Right? Do you know what happened to your people? What was the history of migration, of disruption, of perhaps having to flee or relocate involuntarily, right? How did that impact the people who are closest to you, right? These are often stories that we are unaware of, but we can feel it in our bodies, right? It's present. Rizma Menakem is a social worker who specializes in understanding some racial trauma. And he talks about this idea of trauma ghosting, right? The body's recurrent or pervasive sense that danger is just around the corner. And for Black Muslims, the danger is real, whether it's from law enforcement, it's from being monitored or surveilled, from acts of anti Muslim violence. The danger is there. It's just not something that people are sort of imagining, right? But it's also present sort of in that memory of what may have occurred in prior sort of generations. And then finally, racial battle fatigue is a term that also is kind of used simultaneously with like race-based traumatic stress, but thinking about how exhausted and weary people may feel because of the stress that is present on a daily basis. And most people want to sort of ask about like, well, have you experienced racism, or Islamophobia? When they're asking me that question, often what's implied in the question is something that's like a big T, right? Did someone spit on you? Did they, you know, physically attack you? Well, that is not the only sort of examples of the stress and the fatigue that comes from being discriminated against, right? It is the silent stares. It could be the way people are dismissive or condescending or ignore your presence. It could be in verbal insults or slights, right? And so when you're thinking about both, right, those glaring examples of discrimination and also the really subtle ones, that wears down, a spirit, a soul, how people are able to navigate the world. And again, trying not to just survive, but thrive and have sort of joyful, happy lives. This is, again, the toxins that are present that make that difficult. So, this is just another way or depiction of understanding the violence or the harm that happens on multiple levels to individuals. right? So the personal trauma that happens in your own individual life, what happens to a family, what happens to a community historically, and then also collectively. What is the collective sort of impact on the psyche of a community that experiences centuries of oppression and degradation? So another pause to take a deep breath, right? These aren't um, conversations that are easy to have. And again, if you're sort of present and open and curious about the topic, right, it's going to land in some way on your body. It's going to land on your spirit, right? Again, whether that's confusion or sadness or just disbelief and shock, it's going to land. And so, one of the things that we can do, because we have to, is to take a deep breath, right? And when we take those breaths to remind ourselves that we believe in a just and merciful God. And so while the toxins are present, so is his mercy, so is his guidance, right? And these are the things that give us strength to continue. So, very quickly, into kind of this later portion, again, I want to offer some important terms because when we talk about white supremacy, anti-Black racism, I don't want to assume that we all have the same meaning, right? And I think it's important for us to at least share those definitions, so we're having a conversation and we sort of are speaking the same language. So white supremacy is the idea or the ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior, right, to people of color, right? But it's also not just a thought or an ideology, it's also a political, a socioeconomic system where white people enjoy structural advantage, right? So this is not just, well, I, as an individual white person, I worked hard and, pulled myself up by my bootstraps. No, there is structural systemic advantage afforded to white individuals over those who identify as people of color. Um, Carla Sherrill shared a chapter in a book called Oppression in the Body, which I would highly recommend, Roots, Resistance, and Resolutions. And she talks about this demand to simulate white bodies. And so when we think about the process of assimilation or the process of feeling as if one has to shed one sort of ethnic or racial or religious identity in order to fit in with a white majority, what Dr. Sherrill says is this form of white supremacy demands that if I'm allowed in white spaces, I must communicate in white styles, on white terms. I must simulate white bodies, right? The way that they move, the way white people talk, and not explicitly communicate that I'm doing so. And this is tectonic pressure. I'm reminded that every day, my livelihood in my life may depend on simulating well. And so this calls to mind sort of the violence that has been perpetrated against Muslims, Black Muslims at times, who are speaking a different language, right? Speaking Somali, speaking Arabic, and it is seen as a threat or threatening, and people are attacked because of it, right? Because there's, again, a departure from the simulation of white bodies, and there is violence that is enacted in response to that. So anti-Black racism, right, being two parts, that it voids Blackness of value, right? That there's nothing inherently worthy, right, about Blackness, about Black culture, about Black identity. And anti-Black racism is, again, present in the Muslim community. It is present in our larger society. And so it's coming from two sides. And it's systematically marginalized Black people and their issues. And it makes, again, the structural and systemic racism sort of invisible. It's very covert, right? Hard to detect, but it's there in policies and institutions and ideologies that reinforce, again, the privilege of those who identify as white over those who are Black or people of color. So oppression, again, a word that is used often, but I think requires or necessitates a clear definition of what it means. The systematic subjugation of one social group right, by a more powerful social group for the social, economic, and political benefit of the more powerful group. And so if you're someone who identifies in a minoritized or marginalized group, you're going to feel the impact in multiple ways, right? In your personal life, right? In the lives of your family, on a societal level, right? Institutionally, organizationally. And so this oppression, anti-Black racism, privilege is not just simply sort of your individual experience, right? It's about the way your life is intentionally designed, as Bell Hooks says, for you not to be well, right? And so this is how oppression operates. Thinking about, we have to sort of, again, these things are present, but oppression causes us to forget or pretend as if they don't exist, as if it's not present. And then we have to sort of lie to ourselves. We have to sort of understand, how do I reduce this dissonance between what I know is impacting me, right, and the people around me? And sometimes the way to resolve that is apathy. It's to be numb, it's to deny, right? And then also to lose your voice, right? It's very difficult to sort of speak up and speak out because there are repercussions, right, to naming the structures in your environment that are poisonous, right? But the goal, right, how oppression operates, the goal is to make the power invisible, right? Again, the pollutants are there, right? The toxins are there, but we don't see them with the naked eye, right? And so this is similar to the power of white supremacy, the power of white privilege, is that it feels invisible, but it has a very real impact on your body and your spirit. And so as we move into this last portion, thinking about um, how do we understand, right, who Black Muslims are, the impact of the social toxins on our mental health and well-being, and then understanding that there are systems that are designed to subjugate, right, those who identify as of racial and religious minorities. So if we want to understand what is our role, right, we know that it has a dehumanizing effect, that it has a traumatic effect, right, that it can shorten one's lifespan, like quite literally shorten your lifespan because of those repeated acts of either covert or overt violence or discrimination. Where people might say, where do I begin, right? If this is a system that feels so overwhelming, so traumatic, so powerful, where do I begin? And I would say it begins with introspection and understanding also that while oppression operates in a certain way, there is also a cycle of liberation, right? And that, in my opinion, and in my belief as a Black Muslim, is rooted in understanding the value in who you are, right, as a Black person, and the strength that is gained from your spiritual and religious and faith orientation, right? So my identity as a Muslim grounds me, right, in my own strength. My identity as a Black person, right, as a Black woman, grounds me in that strength and that value as well. And so I have to know that, right? I have to think about it. I have to reflect on it. I have to have reminders of why it is important to love myself, because I'm living in a system that is designed to kill me, right? And if that is my reality, I also need to counter that reality. I have to counter that story with a different narrative. So Dr. Bobby Harrow, again, sort of conceptualized the cycle of liberation in this way, that they're at the core, right? There's self-love and self-esteem, there's balance, there's joy, and there's a spiritual base, right, for the pursuit of liberation. But what I want to sort of bring our attention to here is the interpersonal, right? The getting ready. So if we're thinking about, especially those who are non-Black Muslims, and how do I begin to sort of understand my own privilege, my own disadvantages, the ways in which I'm connected to or relate to Black Muslims, it starts with this empowerment of self, right? So the introspection, the consciousness raising, right? Understanding that change within the core of a people, right, about what they believe about themselves is a starting point, right? Which dovetails so nicely with what we know to be true, right? That, Allah says we do not change the condition of a people until they change what is in their hearts. And so when we think about what is at my core, what do I believe about myself? What do I believe about Black people? What do I believe about Black Muslims, right? Have I given myself space and time to think about what those thoughts and reflections may be, right? I think we have to do this. So the first question is, there are obvious Black stereotypes and tropes which impact, again, the lives of Black Muslims. So asking yourself whether you're Black or don't or identify as non-Black, right? What have I come to believe about Black people, right? What have I internalized about Black inferiority, right? What have I come to believe about the superiority of white people, of whiteness that is detrimental to my own mental health? Okay. We also have to confront, right, the model minority myth, right? Again, a tactic that was used to divide Black and non-Black people of color, right? To say, well, it's the myth often associated with Asian Americans, with immigrants, that if you play by the rules of an American system, and I would wager that this is also true of the Canadian system, that you will be successful, right? Unlike those Black people, if you play by the rules, there will be benefit for you, right? That you will do well and you're striving, right? You believe in meritocracy and, hard work ethic, you'll do well, right? That is the model minority myth that obscures, again, the systemic structural racism, right? And anti-Black violence that becomes detrimental, right, to Black health. So when this is paired with racist myths about other ethnic or racial groups, right, it's used as sort of evidence to deny, right, the impact of racism and discrimination on other people of color, right? So it's to say, well, I've done well. Why haven't you? I can only conclude, and this is, I'm quoting now, I can only conclude that there's something wrong with you, right? This is, again, because oppression is invisible. I can only conclude that something is wrong with you, and this is why you have not progressed. So it leads those who are oppressed to feel, right, this irresistible attraction towards the oppressors and their way of life, right? That demand to stimulate white bodies. And it becomes an overpowering aspiration, right? If I can be upwardly mobile, if I can simulate white people in many different ways, if I can sort of assimilate into that culture, that is the epitome of success. But that success requires adopting views of Black people that are dehumanizing, that are damaging, right? And also acting on those beliefs. So here's my suggestion, right? And I've tweeted about this. So if anybody follows me on Twitter, sometimes I share my thoughts. Is that when racism is discussed within American Muslim communities, right? Because this is the context that I know. Again, I would wager it's also similar in Canadian Muslim communities. There's a tendency to assign Black Muslims the role of identified patient. And I think clinicians, you know what I mean, right? This identified patient sort of phenomenon sounds like, well, we must stand in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters, right? So I say, well, first of all, let's unpack that a little bit. That's a clinical term that is often heard in family therapy, right? Describing one family member in a dysfunctional family who sort of comes to embody all that's wrong, right? So Black Muslims, right, Black people become the identified patient, right? Let's focus on what's wrong with them. Let's focus on what's not going well. And let's forget everything else, right? So as a family systems dynamic, the overt symptoms of identified patient draws attention away from the elephant in the room, right? The identified patient, the Black Muslim, becomes kind of a scapegoat. We become the diversion, right? And when we talk about, well, we need to challenge anti-Blackness in the Ummah, right? I think we need to stop this, right? The root, right, of the problem is white supremacy, it's whiteness, it's oppression, right? And so let's take a look at the root of the problem and not just the fruit, right? The anti-Black racism, the anti-Black Islamophobia, that is just the fruit that is kind of born of this tree of white supremacy, those roots of white supremacy. So those elephants in the room, right, are internalized white supremacy, is aspirational whiteness, right, this overpowering desire to be like white people, again, which requires adoption of those anti-Black values. It's understanding, right, what is the role of white identity, of colonization, of power and privilege. So we can't remedy, right, the illness without a proper diagnosis, right? And clinicians, doctors, right, this is what we do, right? We want to come to the best diagnosis so that the solution, the remedy, the cure that we offer, right, will actually impact and eradicate the disease, right? So anti-Black racism is a system, it's not the disease itself. So if we don't interrogate the ways that whiteness, white supremacy is disruptive in Muslim spaces, right? Or that internalized white supremacy, the model minority myth, those are disruptive and have an impact on the health and well-being of Black Muslims. It's corrosive, it's damaging, it's toxic, right? So if we don't talk about this, because we don't, we will continue to focus on Black Muslims as the identified patient, right? So that the system of white supremacy is invisible, right? And people are sometimes actively resistant to seeing what has been rendered invisible, right? We have to get beyond the blind spots. So my goal for 2021, and I would encourage others to maybe reflect on this, is that we need to shift our understanding to what is the impact of white supremacy on our communities? What is the impact of whiteness, the impact of colonization on all of us, right? How it functions, the complicity that it requires, the way it corrodes relationships, it poisons communities, right? And how it supports mediocrity, abuse, and violence. So I want to leave you with this, because I shared a lot of images about what is traumatic, what is toxic for Black Muslims, but I want also for everyone to remember and to never forget is that there's also Black Muslim resilience and joy. There's always a balance, right? And when we forget that there's a balance, it can lead to, not always, it can lead to, again, feelings of pity, right? Of superiority over Black people and Black Muslims, like, oh, the poor downtrodden folks. Well, I would wager that at least all of the Black Muslims that I know, they don't want to be anything else but Black and Muslim, right? That there is so much strength and richness and beauty in those identities. What we are resisting, right, is the constant dehumanization, right? Is the constant sort of erasure of our humanity and of our beauty. And so we need to see these images as well, right? These are some young people who are fellows in our Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders program, some other young people. So think about the smiles, right? Think about this sort of joy and beauty as serving as a protection, right? As an antidote to those toxins, right? Just the joy of being together, of being in the community, and of being with one's family, right? So these are my my older teens. I have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And so it's the smiles, right? It is the warmth, it's the joy, it's the love that is also very important to remember and to see, right? We don't often see images of Black beauty, of Black Muslim joy, and this is very important as well. So again, some more pictures of the young folks in the drill program. This is my youngest son, Izzy. He's 4 years old, and he loves Batman, obviously, you could see. And, again, silly joy, sort of having fun. Another drill member. And this is my son again, sort of dancing randomly outside. And again, when we think about, well, who's an American Muslim? He is. That's my son, right? He is a third generation Muslim. He is a descendant of enslaved Africans in the US and Caribbean. He is also a descendant of Europeans, kind of given the history of enslavement and violence inflicted on African women, right? He is one who can also trace his lineage to Scottish and Irish and British, white Europeans. And so this is also who Muslims are. So finally, take a deep breath, right? We can understand the trauma, the toxins, right? The systemic nature of dehumanization and anti-Black racism. And remember that we're all impacted by the corrosive effect of white supremacy and of whiteness. And we have to remember that there is also joy, that there's resilience, that those are the factors that protect us, that push us forward, that we draw strength from. And we can never forget how important those are also in our lives and in maintaining our health and well-being. So I'm going to advance just to the end here to takeaways, right? So if we're thinking about where do I begin, right? With that process of introspection is learning about Black Muslim history, right? So the Black Muslim Initiative in Canada, Sapelo Square is an online platform dedicated to exploring the history of Black Islam in the US. And so asking oneself, what have I come to believe about Black Muslims? And I strongly recommend that we begin with a process of introspection, not out of guilt, right? Out of any sort of sense of kind of performative activism or performative sort of consciousness, but what do I know to be true of myself first, right? What do I have to explore? What do I have to come to grips with, right? What have I come to believe about myself due to white supremacy, right? Of colonization, um, and aspirational whiteness, right? So this desire to simulate whiteness and aspire to whatever success looks like according to white standards, right? What have I come to believe? And how does that manifest in my own life, right? So it takes sort of a period of being still, of pausing and thinking about what do I have to know before I do, right? Because if we behave or act without thought, that can actually do more damage, right, to those who are most vulnerable, to Black Muslims, um, and also sort of leaves the burden of having to explain, of having to clarify, to correct, to establish boundaries on the person, the Black Muslim who is most impacted. So if you do your own work, sort of internal, sort of introspection, right, it alleviates some of that burden on someone who is already tasked with trying to survive and thrive in an environment that is very toxic. So this is my contact information. I am Kameelah at muslimwellness.com. I would encourage you all to go to muslimwellness.com and blackmuslimpsychology.org. That has information about our annual conference. I would love to hear your thoughts, either if you've tweeted at me or you have a question in the chat. But again, as I said, this is a lot of information, but I do believe that it's a conversation starter. It is points for us to reflect upon. And I believe wholeheartedly that we can do better with each other, right? We are grounded in a faith that is incredibly profound. It is a way of life. And so if we tap into the values that are shared, if we are humble in our introspection, if we show respect and kind of mutual curiosity, then that becomes a place for us to begin to break down some of those barriers and challenge sort of the root cause, right? Challenge not each other, but challenge the root cause, which is white supremacy, which is colonization. And that is where we can do the work that is going to push our communities forward, inshallah. So thank you. I'm going to stop share.
Incredible. Jazakallah khair. Dr. Rashad, thank you so much for your amazing talk and sharing your insight on this very important yet often overseen topic. I'm really, really excited that you were able to join us today. We do have a few questions from our
Yes.
attendees.
Yes.
They shared on the Q&A section. So I'm just going to maybe read the first question to you.
Okay.
Okay. So one person asked, Dr. Rashad, can you please comment on what Black Muslims in Canada can be doing to support their own mental health and wellness, especially in communities where we're minoritized within the Muslim community?
Yes. So I would say, one of the, I think most impactful ways that I've seen be really beneficial is for individuals to first within their families talk about what's difficult, right? I think because of religious and kind of cultural stigma at times, there is this imperative to show strength, right? Gratitude, to not name, the difficulties or the suffering. And I think that it's important for us to be able to access our full humanity, which includes the desire to be vulnerable, right? To be safe, to be protected, to be nurtured and comforted. And so, I would start with what are the conversations that need to happen at home, right? And if they cannot happen at home, where is there even one safe relationship where someone can be honest, right? Particularly now when COVID is isolating many people, it's causing us to feel even more stress on top of sort of just average, I don't even know what average stress is, right? But the chronic stress that we may experience, um, we shouldn't feel like we have to pretend that we're stronger than we are, right? And being honest does not in any way diminish our sense of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't. Um, these are why relationships are so important. And so I would say for someone to identify first one safe, trusting person that they can be honest with, right? About what's going on, whether it's related to mental health or just kind of stress in life in general.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Rashad. Another question is, how can the Black community unlearn internalized racism?
Again, I these questions are just so amazing, and could be like another hour of conversation. But I think it's to recognize it, right? How does it show up? Does it show up in preference for lighter skinned individuals, right, over darker skin? Does it show up in sort of glorification of straight hair? Does it show up in, um, most often in colorism, right? Sort of this internalized devaluation of Blackness. And so at least I know what happens in sort of Black American context. Is that there's when a baby is born, there's like this fixation on is it going to be lighter? Is it going to get darker? And checking the baby's ears and like the fingernails, and if the baby is light or have light eyes, it's this the sense of like happiness and excitement. That is anti-Black, right? That is saying this is preferred, this is beautiful, right? And if you're brown, right, if you have kinky curly hair, uh, you should change that, right? It's not as preferred. And so I think we have to internally have very honest conversations about not only what it does to us as individuals, but how does it show up in the way that the community is represented, right? And so if we see that even Black Muslim representation is skewed in being as close to white standards as possible, that's a problem. So honesty within our own conversations is a place to begin.
Amazing. Thank you. I have two questions. They're almost similar,
Yeah.
so I'm going to combine the two of them.
Okay.
The question is, in your opinion, what are the best ways to challenge, white supremacy and anti-Black racism within the Muslim community
Mhm.
when we see it? And what role can faith leaders play to support or address this?
Well, I think the role, I'll say first, the role that faith leaders is in addressing the dynamics in the community. And I've noticed that in particular, when young Black Muslims sort of call people out about this, there's a lot of resistance, right? Well, we don't like the way you said it. We don't like the way you do. And it's like, okay, well, separate the message from the messenger, right? Usually young people are unafraid and they're calling out not only what they see, but what they also experience. And so when these are concerns, especially that are raised within a faith community, I think instead of being reactive and having a knee-jerk response to deny that the anti-Black racism is there, I think that that is cause for reflection. Now, why would these young people feel this way? Let me ask them, right? If they're willing to share, what have their experiences been? And before I jump to deny it or to reject it or to say that doesn't exist, right? And this is global, right? When you think about the dialogue that's happening within the Black Muslim British community, the Black Canadian Muslim community, right? The Black American Muslim community, there are similarities, right? Like folks are connecting, right, through technology and saying, wait, you have the same experience I have, right? How is that possible, right? What is the common thread? And so when these are repeated experiences that are reflected in multiple, right, geographical locations, there is merit. So when it is raised within the context of a community, I think it is the obligation of the faith leader to say, I need to find out more, right? I need to address this, right, proactively. And I need to be humble enough to say that there is more the community can do in order to remedy the harm that's been done.
That's a great response.
Mhm.
Thank you, Dr.
Mhm.
Rashad. Comment that we have from one of our attendees is, that your session is very informative and helpful. They said, I find your take on Black Muslims as the identified patients so accurate. This brought me to think about how whiteness can and
Mm.
is perpetuated by non-Black people of color.
Oh, yes.
Question is, are you writing a theory paper or book on your framing of the identified patient? This person would love to read more about this, inshallah.
Well, so my doctoral work, my dissertation was on Black Muslim emerging adults, and so thinking about psychological well-being, identity, and race and religion. And so this is very much part of the reason why I established the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, because even within Muslim mental health, the field, there can be marginalization of sort of Black voices and experiences. So, definitely kudos to you all for hosting a conference that sort of centers this perspective. So I'm writing more, and I'm hoping that there can be more dialogue to kind of flesh out like what are even the nuances, right? There are differences in how Black Muslim men experience the world and how Black Muslim women experience the world. And so I think that we can do a really great job, everyone, of thinking about the role of identity and the intersections of identity. Um, but I would say, for now, you can follow me on Twitter while I share
Great,
some of my musings. But I am writing about it, yes.
great, amazing. So hopefully, um, this we'll be able to read about this sooner than
Yes,
later, I guess. Hopefully.
yes. Hopefully, yes.
So I have another question. It's a bit of a controversial question, but I figured maybe I'll just read it
Okay,
and you could probably try to address it. So I'm going to quote the entire question.
okay.
So the person said, Dr. Salam, Dr. Rashad, your session is very informative and helpful, mashallah. Um, the person said, Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair for this wonderful presentation. Uh, it reminds us to be very watchful for discrimination.
Hmm.
And then I'm continuing the quotation. However, I disagree with the use of the term whiteness in a derogatory sense, just as I would for any skin color. There is neither anything inherently valuable nor detestable about the color of our skin. I understand the need to address the current oppressiveness head on, and the powerful majority today in the West are white skinned. However, this has not always been the case and will not always be the case. If our objection is against oppression, not the color of the oppressor's skin, then let's be careful in our naming it. I look forward to this discussion. So I read this out because this person was
Hmm.
looking for a discussion about this. So
Okay. Well, I appreciate the comment and the willingness to engage with the content, but with all due respect, I would ask that the person, one, understand a bit more about white supremacy, about whiteness, about Blackness, about white identity, and the sort of the political connotations of all of those designations. Um, what I hear somewhat in the comment is what's called color evasive sort of thinking. And that is the desire to, some people call it colorblind, but there are some advocates for that being actually not inclusive of those who are actually disabled. And so in the interest of sort of disability justice, moving to color evasive, um, that the fact is that the world is governed by these systems and these structures and have been for centuries, right? The reason that I am, a descendant of enslaved Africans and of Europeans is due to white supremacy and enslavement. And so this has not only a personal individual impact, but for centuries, right? When we think about even the colonization of the African continent and the long-term effect of that, this is due to white supremacy. This is due to the belief that whiteness is superior. So this is not conjecture on my part, this is fact. And so I think that we need to, if the term sort of offends, I think the person needs to sort of reflect as to why it's so uncomfortable, and then to do more reading, because I refuse to debate the validity of whether whiteness is a fact or to say that it's derogatory. These are facts. So if there is a sense that it is offensive, then I think the person has to do some introspection as to why it feels offensive, when the impact of those systems should cause the most offense.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashad. This is definitely a day of learning for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
I do appreciate that this person is part of this conference, and hopefully they can take that message as well.
Yes.
Another question is, what is your advice to people who see our youth assimilating into whiteness?
Yeah.
And often this comes coupled with losing their Islam. This really troubles me, is what the person is saying.
Mhm.
Is there a way to combat this, and how can we address this?
So I think that if we are addressing sort of the intergenerational trends, I think one thing that's important is that there, for those, for example, who are children or maybe the grandchildren of immigrants, right? The process of assimilation, of trying to understand like being bicultural, right? So if I speak predominantly one language at home and then I go to school and I speak a different language, um, how that is often seen as having a negative connotation, right? When being bicultural, bilingual is actually a strength and a gift. Um, so I think what in the fear of sort of youth moving away from Islam or assimilating into white culture, um, I think the conversation we need to have is what are the expectations or sort of the social norms that are driving how young people are socialized, right? Be successful, do well in school, but but I want you to not forget who you are. And so there's often isn't a clear pathway for how to balance both, right? And it may seem extreme, right? Well, I don't want you to do anything that's associated with white people. Well, I'm going to white schools, right? I may live in a white neighborhood. And so I'm surrounded, right? And there's confusion, there's frustration, there's anger. Um, and if there isn't sort of space for conversation about how difficult it is to reconcile the dissonance, right? Reconcile the differences between those cultural demands. People will leave out of frustration, right? Usually in my work with young people, especially, it's not because they want to. They derive so much of a sense of pride and belonging from the community. But if elders in the community sort of reject their experiences, well, they'll say, why should I stay? Right? If I feel so much harm and dismissal here, um, then perhaps I need to create my own space where I feel safer, where I feel seen. And so I think the conversation that we need to have is not simply why are youth leaving, but what are we doing to make it comfortable and healthy for them to stay?
Thank you. That's amazing. Um, Another comment from another attendee they were able to see your views and tweets.
Mhm.
They're wondering if you could share your thoughts on Instagram as well, because they
Oh,
think that a lot of people might be able to access your amazing work.
yes. Um, I will certainly do so since that person has asked me so nicely.
Good.
Yes.
Lots of amazing comments. Everybody's really excited, to hear you speak. So just reading the Q&A section, a lot of amazing comments about your talk.
Alhamdulillah.
The other question I think you already answered was, how can allies be helping out or act as a supporting role?
Mhm.
Thank
And again, I'll just reiterate. I think it's the introspection, right? Understanding, especially one of the resources that we're at Muslim Wellness Foundation developing for white Muslims is to think about healing from white supremacy and think about, what is the positionality, the privilege that is often afforded to white individuals in the Muslim community. Generally, there is an assumption of or being very deferential to those who identify as white within the Muslim community. And often, again, that stems from beliefs in white superiority, of internalized white supremacy. So you can have someone who is a convert to Islam, maybe a year, and there's this assumption that they're a better Muslim, right? Like, oh my gosh, what have we done to get blessed with this white individual in our community, right? That is a reflection of internalized sort of colonization and white supremacy. Um, and it has an impact on white people as well. And so to think about, well, how do I connect with my community when there's this system that has caused me and socialized me to believe that I'm better, right? That is also degrading to a human spirit, to constantly be fed messages that there is inherent superiority when what Allah tells us is that we are equal.
Thank you, Dr. Rashad. There's one more question. I
Okay.
think we are a few minutes before our
Okay.
session time is up. So
Okay.
one person asked, how can we show people the connections between Islam and combating white supremacy? How can we use Islam as a tool to combat white supremacy?
So I think it comes with really articulating well our values around justice, fairness, community, and that, what I believe to be true is that when there is a thriving Muslim community, everyone who lives in that community, whether they're Muslim or not, benefits, right? That there is this, um, in my community here in Philadelphia, when there are food that's given to community members during Ramadan, for example, people know that they can come to the mosque and be fed, right? And so they associate that generosity and that sense of like an expansive humanity to Muslims. And so I think that is one way that we can begin to really explore, how do we show the sort of the true essence of our faith and how we treat people, right? So not just sort of like the media representations. We all know that those are stereotypes designed for a certain reason. But when people think about um, what do I sort of view or see in my interactions with individuals, and I think also for us to clearly articulate that Islam fundamentally has an anti-racist stance, right? The Prophet's last sermon tells us that there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab. There's no superiority of a Black over a white person. This was in our prophet, our beloved prophet's last sermon. What clear message, right, or position has Islam taken than that? And so I think to remind ourselves of that and also what it means. Um, I would also suggest that folks go to Muslim ARC. It's Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. Marguerite Hill is the current, she's a co-founder and executive director. So muslimarc.org has fantastic resources answering that very question.
Thank you. Dr. Rashad, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. It's been a real honor.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, and for everyone who participated and asked questions and were curious. Thank you. That's
Yes,
all I could say.
thank you
Yeah.
so much. Okay, and now we are at 11:50. I think we're on track in terms of timing. That was just an amazing talk by Dr. Kameelah Rashad. It's been a real honor having her